Welcome back to Jedi Enclave. I'm Daniel.
I'm Chris.
And we are two lonely nerds trying to find our way in the universe.
It's cold and dark out there.
So speaking of cold and dark, it turns out that George Lucas might not have been super happy with how they were taking the Star Wars story in the sequel trilogy after he sold Disney.
I would think that he would be very happy considering he got millions and millions of dollars.
He didn't get millions of
billions.
Dollars. He got $4 billion.
Billions and billions of dollars.
Speaking of billions and billions, we would love to get billions and billions of likes on this video. So, like the video. Do all the warm, YouTube stuff you do for other YouTubers that you like.
I don't know that there are, billions of YouTube accounts, but if there are, hey, I'd love to be wrong.
I'm just trying to be optimistic, Chris. Anyway, so story goes, and this is all coming from Bob Iger's memoir called The Ride of a Lifetime, Lessons Learned from 15 Years as CEO of the Walt Disney Company, which is like the hugest flex in the world in a title.
Yeah, I guess.
So this is how this apparently went. When they were talking about selling, when Lucas was talking about selling Star Wars to Disney, he sent outlines to Bob Iger and some other Disney heads with how he expected the sequel trilogy to go.
How he envisioned the trilogy going.
So Bob Iger read them and was like, okay, we need to buy these outlines, but make it clear in the purchase agreement that they weren't contractually obligated to use anything from him, right? So that's how they set it up. They had the contract going. There's a video I think I have somewhere of them actually signing the contract. I assume it's that contract. Somewhere probably in like the 10th page at the very bottom in fine print, it probably says, George, we're not going to use any of your bullshit stories. Now, please leave us alone.
In much nicer legalese, yes.
Yeah. So he sold it. Everything was fine. I guess before he sold it, he was having George Lucas was having some trouble accepting Bob Iger's demand that Disney have absolute creative control over Star Wars.
I can kind of sympathize with that because, that's your baby you're giving away.
Sure.
But at the same time, they're paying you $4 billion.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because as I was thinking about this earlier today, I've myself have given up what I would consider my intellectual property that I grew for a decade over to someone else at the end of that project. And it was a hard decision. It wasn't like the easiest thing to do. Mm-hmm. He agreed to it nonetheless because like $4 billion.
Just dry your tears with some spare Benjamins.
Yeah, right. He made himself available for consultations, and Bob Iger promised to be open to his ideas, which he would have been anyway. Because, regardless of what you think of any of the Star Wars movies, if you buy Star Wars and George Lucas has something to say about Star Wars, you're going to listen.
A, he's the creator, and B, he is, whatever his other faults, George Lucas is an incredibly creative person.
Yeah.
It is, like, if you have someone who's capable of creating that sort of universe that has that much capacity for telling stories in, it's worth it to at least listen to what he says, even if you don't act on any of it.
Yeah, I think just out of respect, you have a pretty good point there. So several months went by, or years, I can't remember, and Disney invites Lucas to the table, and they're like, okay, this is where we're going with the sequel trilogy. And a few minutes in, he realized that they weren't using anything he had given them. And yes, exactly. He became visibly upset, and Bob Iger was like, "Oh shit!" So what he said in his book was this was unavoidable. This was going to be a hard decision for him to make anyway. We just kind of got off on unnecessarily rough feet at the beginning of the relationship.
Okay.
Now I've got some thoughts about this.
I'm sure you do.
George Lucas, you've said it perfectly earlier about being a creative mind that only comes like once in a generation, maybe not even that often.
Sparingly.
Yeah. That being said, I have not loved every single thing that he's ever done.
Neither have I.
And that includes some of his ideas for the sequel trilogy. He did, James Cameron wrote a book about something to do with sci-fi, something or other, and he interviewed George Lucas. I'm going to read you real quick what George said to him about what his plans for the films were.
Oh, I can't wait.
Oh, just, yeah. The next 3 Star Wars films, we're going to get into a microbiotic world. But there's this world of creatures that operate differently than we do. I call them the wills. And the wills are the ones who are actually controlling the universe. They feed off the Force. If I held onto the company, I could have done it, and then it would have been done. Of course, a lot of fans would have hated it, just like they did Phantom Menace and everything, but at least the whole story from beginning to end would be told. So the whole idea, to paraphrase as honestly as I can, was to have the story be about... Shit, what are they called?
The wills?
No, but no, the other
Amoebas?
things. No, the things in
Midichlorians?
Yeah, midichlorians. I was about to say mitochondria, but like that's a
The
real thing.
powerhouse
Yeah.
of the cell.
Yeah, so he was really going to like double down on that. And so the wills is a different thing, by the way. Before I read that, my understanding of the wills was not that.
Yeah, like, wasn't the midichlorians thing the one part of Phantom Menace that was just, like, universally hated? I mean, besides Jar Jar Binks.
Yeah, I think so, and I think the reason was because why explain a thing that is best not explained and has kind of an aura of mysticism about it?
Yeah.
It's kind of the coolest thing about the Jedi is that like you don't really know where that power comes from. It's vague. It's a really good storytelling device because it has no real definition, and you can do anything with it.
It's also, it adds a little bit to the coolness of the Jedi and the Force that they live in this incredibly scientifically advanced society, and you can't explain the Force with science.
Yeah, it's very metaphysical.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. I think that juxtaposition of science versus
Mysticism.
yeah. I don't want to say faith because that's a totally different thing, but
Yeah.
I think mysticism is a perfect way of saying
And
it.
it was a really cool thing until Phantom Menace came along, and you could just see if you were Force sensitive by taking a blood test.
Yeah. Now, they abandoned that. George Lucas abandoned it very quickly because I don't think midichlorians are ever again mentioned in any of the subsequent films. And I'm trying to think of a reference, and maybe if you're watching, you can help me out with this. If you can think of some like obscure Clone Wars novel mention of midichlorians or something.
It's certainly in a book somewhere.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And I know that there was a scientist that was trying to, in the Jedi Apprentice series, that was trying to study the Force and everything.
In fact, there was... So, I believe it was shortly before the Disney acquisition, there was a set of 3 books that came out, little tiny hardcover books. It was, I think, The Jedi Path, The Sith Code, and The Bounty Hunter's Manual. Have you seen these?
Oh, I have, yeah.
So there's a section in the Sith Code which is supposedly written by Darth Plagueis where he goes into a lot of detail about the science behind the Force and how he wants to understand it scientifically. And he actually does talk about midichlorians, and the implication is that Darth Plagueis led to the fatherless but Force-driven impregnation of Shmi Skywalker, which led to Anakin, which led to Darth Vader.
Yeah, I think that there's a reference to that in a recent, like within the last few months, and I'll find it if I can and put it up in the video.
Yeah, I should mention that I am not totally sure about the publication date of these books. They might not even be canon anymore.
Well, that's the thing though, is that this comic that was recent kind of hints at the same thing, more or less.
It's interesting.
Yeah, but not so much the midichlorians or the science-y kind of thing about it, but that they were responsible for Anakin.
Yeah.
And that was definitely kind of explored in James Luceno's book called, I think it's called Plagueis or something. So as I'm thinking about this is one of those hot button topics about Star Wars, like everything else in Star Wars right now.
Yeah.
That like. I'm sure there are probably some people screaming at me, like of all the tens of people watching, like half of them are screaming about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so what they don't understand is that I'm, like, the original trilogy, like, that shit is my life, man. Like, it's my favorite thing about the whole thing. George Lucas is a genius, and he's a better creative mind than I'll ever be, and I'm willing to admit that. But it didn't make him infallible. And this story about Bob Iger's book and everything comes off to me a little bit like George Lucas wanted his cake and he wanted to eat it too. And it, like I said, I understand the conflict behind it, holding or giving over something that you've created and never being able to change it again. Like, I get that, but you knew what you were getting into when you sold it. You knew that you weren't, and I refuse to believe that they misled him. I refuse to believe that Bob Iger was like, we will do every one of these things. This is the next 3 movies right here.
Like, Disney has really good lawyers working for them. They have really good everything working for them, but lawyers especially. And if Bob Iger went into a meeting with his legal team and said, look, we cannot use these outlines. They are completely nonsensical. They will ruin the franchise forever. Make it clear in the contract that we are not required to use these. His lawyers would have said, okay, written it out, and George Lucas probably wouldn't even understood what was in the text.
Well, I would have assumed he had lawyers that looked it over too.
Sure.
But I think the only argument that could be made is that it was in the contract, but Bob Iger was like, oh, it's just a legal boilerplate. Don't worry about that. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that happened either. Mm-hmm. I think that he legitimately was like, these are great stories. You're the creator of Star Wars. We will seriously consider them. And I'm sure they did seriously consider them. I just, from reading about different accounts of what his vision for the sequel trilogy would have been, I don't know if I would have liked it. I think it would have been a little weird for me.
I think Lucas wanted to take Star Wars in a direction other than what it is.
Which is a different conversation. Yeah. But by the way, we're not saying that because we don't super love Lucas's version, that means by default that the existing version was so much better. It's just that I can sympathize with the position he was in and the call that he had to make, especially to shareholders and other creative minds who are kind of in charge of it as well. Mm-hmm. It had to be a hard call, and I think they probably made the right one. I think starting from scratch was probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, the thing is, for better or worse, Star Wars is the most famous space opera intellectual property in the world. Mm-hmm. If you try to take that well-established space opera and diverge it into, I don't even know what I would call this, like microscopic mysticist postmodern
he
whatever.
He even made clear that the microscopic creatures weren't necessarily good guys.
Yeah.
That they might have been a little malevolent.
But the point is, if you take that hard of a left turn, you're going to lose your entire fan base.
Yeah.
And you might pick up a few people who are looking for that, but they're not you can only fill so many art house movie theaters.
Sure. Yeah, I think what this all boils down to is Star Wars fans are upset that they're not... The new films aren't just like the original trilogy, but at the same time, they're not new. Because you can't do... they've tried both of them. They did a copy of A New Hope, and then they did the next film that was the biggest departure from Star Wars we've ever seen, and that wasn't good either. So
honestly, you could have just stopped at Star Wars fans are upset.
Yeah, I know. I love you guys, though. I really do. Let me know what you think about the story. What would you have done if Star Wars was yours and you sold it for $4 billion?
After counting your money for a very long time.
Right, after you've rolled around in it naked already. Like the video, comment, let us know what you think. Reach out to us on social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter. And we're also launching our podcast on various podcast places, I guess.
Did we ever hear back from Apple?
We did. We'll talk about that later.
Okay.
But if you're hearing this now, we might be on iTunes. And if we're not, we will be. So keep checking back. And just remember...
The ability to speak does not make you intelligent. Now get out of here.